Egypt and the origin of the Egyptians. Egypt, our beloved homeland, is undisputedly the oldest nation in the world. It forms the lower part of the Nile Valley, bordered by the First Cataract to the south, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, the Arabian Desert to the east, and the Libyan Desert to the west. In ancient times, the name Kemi was preserved until the Greeks came and renamed it Aegyptios. The etymology of this name has yet to be fully explained. The best explanation is Ha-Ka-Ptah, meaning the place of the same god Ta, who was worshipped in the town of Memphis, the capital of Egypt during the Old Kingdom. The word Kemi means black land and was used to refer to the fertile, cultivated valley. The land surrounding it to the east and west was called Ta-Dsher, which means in Egyptian the red land, or the desert. There is no doubt that Egypt owes its life to the Nile River. The historian Herodotus was right when he said, quoting the historian Hecateus, who lived during the reign of Ptolemy I, that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. In fact, this great river overflows the country with its abundant goodness all year round, as the seepage caused by its water supplies the underground aquifer, which is indispensable for the growth and nourishment of plants during the fires. The annual Nile flooding brings fertility and growth to the land through the silt it brings with it each year, leaving it on the surface of cultivated land for the growth of trees, plants, and animals. From this, we see that without the Nile River, Egypt would become a barren desert, and life there would be impossible, especially when we realize that nature has virtually deprived it of rainwater and left it suffering under the scorching sun for long periods of the year. Therefore, the wretched people who inhabited the arid regions, i.e., the Red Land, lived in a meager livelihood, eking out a living from the scant rains that the sky bestowed from time to time, and from the few wells scattered throughout those barren deserts. Accordingly, the Egyptians who lived in comfort in the lush Nile Valley viewed these people with contempt, considering them savages. Since the ancient Egyptians believed that the Nile drew its water from the rocks of the First Cataract at Aswan, Elephantine, they considered all the lands south of these rocks to be completely foreign to Egypt. Egypt had been inhabited since prehistoric times by a Hamitic people said to have originated in the country itself, i.e., of African origin. They are attributed to the North African Lobi, now called the Berbers, and to the Hamitic population of North Africa. There is no doubt that the Egyptian Hamites represent the oldest known civilization, the Eastern Somalis, in the Nile Valley. Accordingly, Egypt is part of the group of other African Hamitic civilizations. However, toward the end of the pre-dynastic period, we find some changes beginning to enter this Hamitic people, a race that originated from the nature of the country itself. This change appears to have been brought about by migration. The most important new elements that entered the country appear to be of Asian origin, and they had distinctive characteristics that differed markedly from the original population. These Asians gradually mingled with the indigenous population and became integrated into them. As for the question of the entry of these Asian tribes into Egypt, the direction from which they entered and took control of the country, and the specific era in which they entered, scholars have not agreed on a definitive opinion. Some say that the immigrants or conquerors came to Egypt from the Arabian Peninsula and entered via the Red Sea from Kift or via the Upper Nile Valley. Others say that the invaders came from Syria and entered Egypt via Palestine, Sinai, and the Eastern Delta, from where they spread throughout the Western Delta and then Upper Egypt. From here, a difficult problem arises before us that has yet to be resolved. Did pharaonic Egyptian civilization emerge in the north or the south? That is, did Egyptian civilization begin in the Delta or in Upper Egypt? Indeed, there are arguments to support both theories. Those who favor the view that the displaced people came from the south do so because all our information about this ancient era is derived only from a few excavations conducted in Upper Egypt, even though there are archaeological sites even older than these in the Delta, some of which have only recently been scientifically discovered, such as the Maramda area. They do not provide us with all the information we need to base our opinion on. Likewise, we find that the worship of the god Horus, considered one of the oldest Egyptian deities, entered Egypt from the south via Nubia, the Upper Nile Valley, or via Wadi Hammamat following an invasion by a people called on monuments Horus followers, as some historians claim. On the other hand, we find that some of the most notable features of the formation and growth of Egyptian religion appeared in Lower Egypt. For example, the most famous cults that gradually spread throughout the country were the worship of the god Osiris, originating in the town of Abus or near Samanut, and the worship of the sun god Ra, originating in the town of Ain Shams near Cairo. In addition, many of the lands of Upper Egypt were named after cities taken from the delta that were older than them. Therefore, it is highly likely that the new race invaded the country from northern Syria via Palestine and Sinai, bringing with it a more advanced civilization than that of the original Hamitic race, which knew only stone tools and vessels. As for the invaders or immigrants, it is said that they introduced into the country the knowledge of metals, especially copper, as well as their worship of the dead, their religion, their writing, their arts, and their social and political systems. There is no doubt that the entry of this race into the country occurred gradually and without violence. Whatever the truth about this new race, one thing is certain. The invaders succeeded in seizing control of the country little by little. The most important historical documents that have come down to us from this era are the inscribed slate tablets. These inscriptions have come down to us in various forms, and it is difficult to decipher them. However, they are the only memory we have of this long conquest, which apparently ended with the unification of the entire country from Aswan to the Mediterranean under the scepter of one king, whom all historical sources agree was King Menes. There is no doubt that the relationship between Egypt's oldest period and Asia existed. However, we need not exaggerate the importance of the spread of Asian nationality in Egypt. The reality is that the country's civilization is rooted in Africa. Therefore, we see that the immigrant race has, over time, integrated into the country's population. Thus, we find that the language, agriculture, and religion that grew and flourished in the country are tinged with the culture of its indigenous people since their earliest times. The immigrants had no significant influence on any of these changes. Rather, their influence was superficial. However, the information we have about this era does not allow us to be certain of anything. We must also imagine that the immigrants were only a small number compared to the indigenous population. The reality is that the dominant immigrant groups were adopting the civilization they found flourishing in the country, while introducing some reforms and improvements to it as much as possible. However, we have no information to prove whether Egyptian civilization owes its origins to the Asian conquerors, who brought domestic animals such as bulls, pigs, donkeys, and goats, as well as the earliest grains such as barley and wheat, or whether, on the contrary, these animals and grains had been present in the Nile Valley since the original African race existed. We also do not know whether the language of the migrating tribes influenced ancient Egyptian and infused it with an Asian tinge, a phenomenon evident in several words in the language of the people. Since the beginning of the historical era, we have found a great deal of integration between the two sexes that make up the population, to the point that it has become extremely difficult to accurately determine the differences between them.